Imagine you're living somewhere near the nuclear facility of Chernobyl in Ukraine, and you're thinking, is the radiation getting bad? Remember, there was basically a nuclear accident there in 1986. Something like 24 people died in the immediate sort of event, but somewhere between, on the low end, 4,000 people, and on the high end, 50,000 people have perished since then from some kind of radiation poisoning. But imagine you're living somewhere near there and you're thinking like, is the wind bringing too much radiation here? Is there sort of leaching of ground soil through the water? Is it safe, basically? And this is a question that a lot of people will have in various communities. Remember, there was just a nuclear event in Fukushima, Japan. We had our own 3 Mile Island event here. No one was hurt then, but you can imagine this kind of scenario happening. And so scientists have created this idea. There's a plan afoot for the nuclear radiation cats. And this idea is to breed a subspecies of cat that is genetically modified such that when it comes in contact with radiation, it changes color. And lest you think this is impossible or too science fiction, this has actually been done to some extent already in sort of small experiments. Even one of the first artists, Eduardo Keck, actually created a sort of glow-in-the-dark bunny rabbit, I think, and this was decades ago. So people who have been interested in genetic modification have been working with mammals and their coat colors, for decades. So their idea was, let's say you're living near Chernobyl or near some site that you have some question about. You have a house cat as a pet, but all of a sudden it changes from white to green. I don't know what the color change would be exactly, but then it's time to get out of Dodge. It is time to get out of your place and move on to somewhere else and take your green cat with you. That brings us to the question I want to talk about today, which is nuclear semiotics. How will we communicate to our descendants that will be living, let's say, in the United States, which will be called something else by then, and they'll be here not just in 10,000 years, but in 30,000 years from now, and upwards to 200,000 years in the future. And for up to 300,000 years, the nuclear waste that we're burying will still be toxic. So that's an enormous time scale, and you have to think about how will you communicate to somebody, hey, stay away from this area. This is very bad for your health. When they no longer speak English, they may not even speak a language with their mouths for all we know. I don't know what's going to happen in our future evolution. But there's teams of people all around the world working on this problem. And so today, on Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge, Nuclear Semiotics, also a discussion of how images communicate meaning. We can go all the way back to the cave art. And we're going to consider how we might be able to tell a story with images that might still communicate to our descendants in hundreds of thousands of years from now. So, welcome. We have something here in the United States called the Waste Isolation Pilot Program, or WIPP for short. And it is a group that is working on sort of the technical issues of storing all of this radiation waste that's been, collecting for decades. What's happened is a shaft has been dug deep into the desert in New Mexico. This shaft goes 2,000 feet underground, sort of a whole array of caves and sort of tunnels down there. And this is where nuclear waste will be stored for the next 10 or 20 years until it's filled up. So let's say it takes 20 years to fill it up with nuclear waste. Then what's going to happen is WIPP will basically fill that with cement and dirt and then seal off the entire project or complex. So there's a bunch of buildings on the top of it now. Those will all be removed. And then they'll have to create a kind of a 4 square mile system of warnings to keep people out of this region for thousands of years. So the question is, how do we do that? Like, what's the best way to make a sign or a symbol that will last for thousands of years? And what do we put on the sign? Like, what are the images? What kind of symbol system should be used that will convey to people that this is a bad place? So the current plan is to have 25 feet tall granite columns placed all around the sort of 4-mile region. And it's kind of interesting that they've thought through the fact that in 10,000 years or 50,000 years from now, the erosion might be so dramatic that basically these monuments will have decayed. Perhaps the images we've put on them will be removed by just regular weather erosion. And even it's possible that the soil will be stripped away over many thousands of years until eventually these things topple over and are buried. So what's clever about the WIPP is that they're also burying the same symbol systems in granite columns 20 feet down below the ones that'll be sticking up currently. So they're sort of imagining what would the earth in this region, the soil, look like in tens of thousands of years, possibly hundreds of thousands of years. And they're using this sort of backup plan of redundancy to kind of help with the situation. Then the WIPP is planning on making documents. And these documents will be written on not regular paper, which won't last very long, but some kind of really stable substrate. And then these documents will be placed in archives all around the world that will also have this symbol system that will try to explain what the danger is in New Mexico. And so that's very interesting too. You try to set up these redundancy systems so that if everything, falls apart politically and economically, then maybe in one other part of the world, some bit of information will survive. It's a little bit like when Plato and Aristotle were writing, or even think about the Egyptian hieroglyphic writings, then a lot of that stuff would be lost. Sometimes it was lost permanently. We still don't have tons of writing that's referred to by other scholars, but sometimes it reemerges and then we don't know how to translate it. And so, for example, the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, people in Renaissance Europe were trying to decode it, sort of just making up shit, basically. And it wasn't until the Rosetta Stone was found in the 1790s by French soldiers in Egypt that they were able to see, okay, here's an image of a hieroglyphic sort of proposition, and then here's the Greek equivalent. And so the Rosetta Stone showed you how to translate hieroglyphics, which were basically mysterious to us for about 3,000 years. So WIPP is trying to create a system where you'll have all kinds of possible translations, and maybe we need even to sort of have a whole bunch of little Rosetta Stones where all the languages, the root languages, like sort of the Romance languages and the Cyrillian languages, are all then translated to or connected to the imagery that we make. And those could be put all around the world too, like little Rosetta Stones to be found like in 100,000 years from now. In fact, it's not clear why you would even use a giant monument, like a giant monolith. Maybe the smarter play is to create a whole bunch of warnings that are just the size of like a coin. And then you just put thousands of them sort of all around the territory so that people in tens of thousands of years could find these coins, and they each would be a kind of small little warning. That might be a better play given what we know about archaeology. Like, we've learned a lot about history by studying coins. A lot of what we know about sort of early Carthage and battles even between ancient Roman cultures and Carthage, like, are understood by looking at the coins, and who was in power when is sort of printed on the coins. And so maybe we need some system like that in New Mexico for warning people about the nuclear dangers. The problem with the standing stone is something I experienced myself. I remember I went to the Isle of Islay in Scotland, which those of you who drink scotch will know all about Islay, which is why I went there, because that is where they basically have the distilleries for many of the very best single malt scotches. Some of my favorite scotch is distilled there, and they have these wonderful walking trails that they've made. It's not very touristy. I can remember when I did these kind of distillery tours. I think it was me and like 4 other people just sort of going from one place to the next and getting utterly wrecked. And there was a sort of a trail from this great distillery, Lefroy, up to Lagavulin, up to Ardbeg. And so I was walking along the seaside on this island, just stopping at distilleries, getting the tour, and then they give you drams of whiskey to take with you and to drink on the spot. And so I'm completely fractured as I walk around, and it was beautiful. I mean, it's just stunning, with green pastures and sheep grazing, the sea on one side. It's very unpopulated. It's very kind of back to nature kind of feeling there. But there's some famous standing stones there. And so I hiked my way to this standing stone. As I said, I was under the influence, but I got to it, and it's the middle of this farmer's field. It's a good thing nobody shot at me. I guess that only happens in America. But there were sort of sheep around, and I'm standing in front of this giant, wonderful standing stone, and I tipped one out in recognition of the, Celtic ancestors that sort of built this thing. And I stood there for a long time and realized, of course, I have no idea what this thing means. And no one does. The standing stone, if it had anything sculpted on it or written on it, that's long gone. It's just basically a tall, vertical rock. And it means something because it's not random and it doesn't belong in this area, and its position is clearly man-made, but you have no idea what it's trying to communicate to you, or even if it is trying to communicate to you. And that tells you something important about how our descendants may read these giant pillars, because if you can't read the image on it and it's just a giant, interesting looking granite structure, you won't know what the hell it means. It might actually have the opposite effect that you want. It might draw people to it. They were talking, for example, about building these cement thorn-like structures to keep people away, just make it so uninviting. But with human nature being what it is, that people would be drawn to that. And so that they abandoned that idea. And so it raises this very interesting question about, how do we communicate? How do signs and symbols get meaning? How do we fasten on to their referent, what they're referring to? And how do they tell us what we should do in a kind of imperative way? There is a current symbol for radiation, the kind of warning symbol, and you've seen it. It has these sort of 3 black blades coming off a central sort of circular shape. And you might recognize it as being a warning, but apparently, according to recent studies, only about 6% of the human population currently recognizes that as a warning symbol for radiation. So if only 6% of the current human population understands what that means, how do you think people are going to read it in 100,000 years from now? That's just not going to work. Another idea that they've sort of toyed with at the WIPP and other sort of organizations, because there's a similar organization in the UK, and also one, I think, on the continent. This other idea they've been toying with is maybe we could make a kind of ritual, cultural system, almost like a religious ritual that says this area is dangerous. And we inculcate this almost like it's a yearly or even a monthly sort of ritual demonstration where you have priest class and you have followers or devotees, and they engage in a kind of ceremonial re-articulation that this place is dangerous. And of course, they'd have to do it from a safe place, distance, saying this is a forbidden zone. And the idea was, it's sort of smart in a way, because if you think about this from an anthropology point of view, it is true that religions, like pagan religions, have lasted a very long time, and in some form or another, they can persist over thousands of years and communicate something. But can they persist for tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years? There's no evidence that that's true. It also raises all kinds of problems, because religions, as you know, and rituals, they evolve very rapidly. All cultural phenomena evolve way faster than biological things evolve. So this thing could turn into something you didn't want it to be at all. It could turn into its own death cult for all you know. But I do find it funny that there's a sort of movement of people within the nuclear semiotics research area that are trying to think about this almost like it could be a kind of religious warning system, and that there could be these radiation priests in the future, maybe after the death of our society and even the death of science. They'll just be like these weird cults that sort of know to stay away from this area. That just strikes me as both amusing and really dark. I think it's impossible to keep something going for 50,000 years. I mean, if you think about it, even fire starting is a technology or a technique that has to be culturally transmitted. Like, there was a time when no human beings knew how to start a fire. What they did was, if they found something that was burning, like let's say lightning hits a tree and causes a fire, they would sort of capture the fire and they would carry it, some kind of a skin, a bag of some kind, where they would carry the embers, protect it. Eventually, you could do this in some kind of like dried out clay, earthenware stuff, but they were fire carriers long before they were fire starters. And we do know from the archaeological record that human beings acquired fire starting abilities and then they lost them. So imagine it was like a guild where you have a small band of people surviving. Let's say it's just 30 people, and you have like one family. Those are the fire starters, and they know how to do it. They know how to sort of rub the sticks together and get if you think this is easy, try starting a fire. If you have not had a very intense Boy Scout or Girl Scout training, modern people like us are not going to be as good at this as you think you are. Oh, you've seen it on TV, but that doesn't mean you can do it when the wind is blowing and the snow is blowing and you don't have the right supplies. So imagine you have a guild where some people can do this and others can't, and then that whole family gets wiped out. Now all of a sudden, the 30 people who were dependent on them for the fire are suddenly don't know how to make fire anymore. And so this happened throughout the evolution of human beings repeatedly. And that means that cultural transmission is something that's very fragile. So imagine that you create some kind of message and you're going to try and keep it alive for 50,000 years or 100,000 years. There's no reason to think that that's going to work because, as I said, cultures are very fragile and can succumb to just accidents, changes in the economy, in local warfare, in just all kinds of stuff can make it go wrong. So in a way, you have to think about nuclear semiotics sort of like a message that has to transcend culture. It can't be something that is only kept alive through cultural transmission. It has to transcend sort of time and place so that someone who has no connection to our past will still be able to understand it. And that means you need something that appeals directly to human nature, whatever that is. Can there be a message that any human brain would be able to understand independent of its cultural history? Some people say yes, other people say no, that's impossible. So you need a kind of image that I'm going to call a didactic image, which means a teaching image, an image that teaches you something. The WIPP has come up with a pictogram. This is the one that they're floating now. They have not actually put these on, the signs, but they're sort of discussing this as a possibility. And it's a series of images, and when I look at it, I can't really tell what the hell it means. So I don't know how our descendants are going to be able to tell what it means. It shows a little dude, and it shows this kind of tower, and then it shows all these symbols of radiation, which, as I said, only 6% of humans now understand, and that's sort of floating around. Then there's sort of a multiplication of these little radiation symbols, and then the little dude is flipped over and looks kind of dead, which I think is kind of a smart move, because the more sort of iconic you can make it and suggest like 1 minute you're healthy and the next minute you're dead, that seems intuitively like the way to go, right? But when I look at this, it's very confusing. So I just don't know how our descendants are going to read it. And one way to think about this is to just think about cave art, because we are sort of like our descendants will be in 30, 40,000 years from now, facing images that we see on cave walls and trying to understand what do they mean. So it's a really good allegory, or analogy to what their challenges are going to be. And so if you think about cave art, the earliest representational cave art we have are these pigs from Sulawesi in Indonesia. These pigs in Indonesia are sort of on the wall with other kinds of images. I think some of those hands are there that you're used to seeing where our ancestors would have blown a kind of pigment around the hand. And I think the pigs also have like these little humanoid characters in the scenes too, with bow and arrows, I believe. This cave art goes back to around, I think, 45,000 years old, maybe 50,000 years old, but that's the representational art. It's actually interesting that you can tell what's supposed to be happening, we think, because it's a narrative story, or at least you can read it as a narrative story, because if you've got pigs and you have hunters, then you kind of know what's going on, right? That's different from some of the other images that go back even earlier. So there are images that go back to around 75,000 years old, and those are much more sort of iconographic, pictographic. We don't know what they are, but they're clearly designs. For example, there's a hashtag that you see all over the world, and these other symbols, they're not clearly representational. It's not supposed to be a pig, it's not supposed to be a man. We don't know what it means. But it's interesting that non-representational symbols go back twice as far as these representational images of animals. That itself is very mysterious, because if you think about it, the entire history of art has been the opposite. Like if you studied art history, you would have started with representational art, images of human beings and animals and plants, and then it would have developed, through the ancients and the medieval and then the Renaissance. And this is Western art, but you could tell a similar story about Eastern art or Chinese art or African art. And then eventually, when you get very recent, like the 20th century, maybe the late 19th century, you start to get abstract expressionism, and you start to get abstract images. So the story of art in art history has been from representation to these weird symbols that are non-representational. You get like Jackson Pollock, and you get Kandinsky, and you get these artists that are just playing with forms. But what's shocking is if you reverse that all the way to the earliest representational art, then you keep going backwards, you end up all the way to non-representational symbols again, which is very strange. And no one knows why. No one knows what it means. I mean, one theory is these kind of weird designs could be communications of some kind, sort of a proto-language, or they could be just decoration. Maybe these are just decorations on things prior to when people knew how to draw. So that's another possibility. What is clear, though, is that when human beings start marking rocks and cave walls and other implements, then they are basically now putting information for the first time outside of their brains. And that's a pretty exciting change because it indicates a cognitive evolution point. And that's really sort of exciting. But let's set that aside for a moment, and let's think for a moment about some of these symbols. A wonderful archaeologist named Genevieve von Petzinger basically went around and just sort of crawled into all these caves all around the world because she asked herself, is there any common lexicon of images or symbols in all of these caves that we found all around the world? And amazingly, she discovered that there is. There's a finite number, it's something like 35 actual icons or symbols, and you find them all over the world in our prehistory. So you'll see not just the hand where the pigment is sprayed around the hand, but you'll also find this hashtag I was referring to. You'll find the spiral that goes out from the center. You've seen that before. That's in many places. Sometimes you see something that looks like an eye. So it raises this question, is there a common culture of human beings bringing these images all over the planet? Or is there something where there's something universal that comes from the mind itself, independent of a cultural history? You can get kind of mystical here. You can sort of get Jungian with the collective unconscious, and all human beings around the world during prehistory were accessing, a collective unconscious. Or you could say, well, without getting kind of mystical, you could say, well, if these things are a kind of proto-language, maybe they clearly refer to challenges in the natural environment that all human beings faced, like this maybe hashtag means like fishing net or something, and everybody had to fish. And so there's other ways that are more sort of naturalistic to try to explain this, but it's kind of fun to think about. One place to look at this, sort of resolving this question, is to look at childhood development. Do kids all end up sort of drawing similar things in their early development? Or is that all just taught to them through their culture? Is there some, just like you can ask about language, are there some natural sort of linguistic tendencies that happen earlier, like mama, baba, start to happen in a child when the deep grammar kicks in? Is there a kind of image-making deep grammar that all human beings start to engage with? And there's some interesting evidence here. For example, all kids will, when they're given sort of writing implements, crayons and stuff, they'll start out by doing this kind of just arm motion where they just rub the thing on, and it's very pleasant for them. They enjoy it. And there's evidence actually that chimpanzees also enjoy this. There's a famous case of a chimp, but they basically gave him a paintbrush and paint, and every morning he would paint on canvas. And they couldn't even get him like to come away for like lunch or whatever. He was so into it, and he really looked forward to it. But he didn't represent anything. It's not like he painted like a dog or a vase of flowers or anything. He just kept putting the pigment on like in this motion, and it seemed to be just a mechanical thing that he was enjoying. So kids start out doing that. Then it turns out all kids do this thing. What do they call it? It's the tadpole people. And you'll see this, if you have young kids, look on your refrigerator, because you've probably tacked this on your refrigerator. But it's like, they'll draw the head of a human, so it'll be like an oval shape with eyes and a mouth, and then just like all the rest of the body is just this like simple appendage hanging down. Like there'll just be like, just sort of a vague arm leg thing coming off of this tadpole looking thing. And it turns out that most kids all around the world do something like this. And it's curious, like, are they making an icon or a symbol of a human being that's meant to be abstract, or do they just really suck at drawing, and this is their best attempt at making a body? Those are two different things, and we don't know which one it is. So that's actually kind of exciting and curious. You wonder whether the individual development, the ontogeny of the person, maps or mirrors the species level image making or the phylogenetic image making tendencies. And what happens with kids is drawing is very common for most kids if they have the ability to do it, or the tools or the implements. And then suddenly around age like 3 and 4, their drawing drops off. And only a tiny fraction of the people who started drawing continue drawing. The rest of human beings abandon drawing and seem to move in favor of language as their primary communication and mode of expression. But it's funny that before language, drawing is a very common way of expressing or communicating for all human beings. A few years ago, I was basically taking a drive across country, and I stopped in New Mexico. And in New Mexico, there's this wonderful, I wouldn't call it a mountain, it's like a mound. And you hike up to it. It's called Three Rivers. And at Three Rivers, they have these petroglyphs. And there's thousands of petroglyphs, which are these basic drawings or etchings into the stone. And it's basically like an hour-long hike, and you can see probably, certainly I saw dozens, maybe up to 100 of these things. Some of them are just really well preserved, and some of them are just fading away, and in a matter of years they'll be entirely gone. But they're all over this mound, and they just litter the whole area, and they're very representational. They're not like these hashtags. They really look like something, and you can recognize what they look like. And it's exciting because they really look a lot like a drawing, let's say, of a sheep, and it looks a lot like something that a kid would draw today. And in fact, if you look at their drawing of a person, and there's a drawing of a lizard, and I remember a wonderful drawing of a sheep, they look a lot like something that an illustrator would do to sort of do a kind of iconographic representation of these animals. Now, here's what's really cool about Three Rivers. Anthropologists suggest that these were all carved somewhere between, I think, the 10th century of the Common Era, so like 1,000 years ago, and maybe 1400 or 1500 AD. So all of these images would have been carved before Europeans arrived in the Americas. Now that's very, very interesting because if you think of the pictorial tradition as culturally transmitted, then it's just a series of permutations and evolutions based on the earliest sort of imagery that we came up with in the West. But that couldn't be what these are, because these would have been humans who came across the Bering Strait and evolved in the Americas independent of the European pictorial tradition. And so that's super exciting because it suggests that we don't read this image or icon as a sheep because we just come from a certain culture and we're trained to do that. It suggests something more universal, that all human beings will sort of transfer a three-dimensional animal onto a two-dimensional surface in similar ways. That is just a big sort of cognitive transfer, and it looks like human beings do it similarly, independent of cultural connection. That gives us some hope for the nuclear semiotics, because if we can find just the right iconography that all human minds will read similarly, then we'll know how to do it for our descendants, in 100,000 years from now. So it's an interesting question. Who do you ask on this? Should we ask the eggheads in the universities to tell us how human beings read images? Or should we ask the artists who maybe they haven't studied all the theory of semiotics and they don't know their postmodern, Derrida, Foucault, whatever, but they make art and they know how to communicate with people through art? Which of these two would be better to consult when you make the nuclear signs, the nuclear warning signs? I submit that it's the artists who are communicating directly without sort of highfalutin semiotic theory. They might be more trustworthy in communicating to our descendants in 100,000 years from now. Why is that? I think the answer is something like this. Images are really good at conveying emotional information. They're better, I think, than text. Now, there's some exceptions to this. Poetry is also very good at sort of conveying emotional power. Literal language is not very good at this. It's too busy trying to describe the world rather than just make you feel it directly. But images will make you feel fear or anger. So imagery then could be properly situated to convey to people, hey, you should be afraid here. You don't need to understand why exactly. Maybe we can't tell you all about radiation and what we did here, 100,000 years ago, but at least you will know that this face is the face of terror, or like you have, again, like the sequence where you have like healthy dude standing there and then dude laying over with X's on his eyes. I don't know whether that's a universal icon or not, the X's on the eyes. Does that mean you're dead for everyone? But you see, my point is that the image really does convey emotions in a way, and therefore it conveys imperative content, not just kind of descriptive, indicative content. And that could be the way that we successfully communicate to our descendants in the future. So if you want to reach across time and place to communicate to someone, then some kind of dramatic imagery, the use of drama, storytelling images may be the only way to do it, because that is the only way to transcend the sort of ambiguities of language and just speak directly to human nature, particularly the emotional part of human nature. Now, here's the kind of scary thing, though, which is if we're talking about human beings in 100,000, maybe 200,000 years from now, what's to say that their emotional palette, their emotional lexicon will be like ours? That is very interesting to consider. What if, people think about human evolution all the time, like projecting it way into the future. What if our minds are very different? What if people aren't afraid anymore? They don't have fear. Something's happened in culture and society such that fear isn't there, and so they don't read it in the same way. It's hard to imagine this because fear is so widespread among mammals generally, and it's so useful. But I think you take my point. What if the emotions are different in the future and they don't hit in the same way with the images of today? So that's an interesting puzzle to think about and just to raise a little skepticism. All right, so this has been fun. I really enjoy this topic. I like to think about images as being didactic teaching forms. What are their limits? What are their potentials? And also, will it be the kind of thing that saves our descendants in the future or just leaves them scratching their heads? Thanks for tuning in. As always, I'll see you next time, and always stay curious.